So how then will this war of attrition end? We've been emphasizing so far that this is going to be a long war, that it can only end when one side gets tired and essentially collapses. The first country to collapse will be Russia. Remember, Russia, I had emphasized earlier, is only semi-industrialized. It has not undertaken to any great degree the political, economic, scientific, and industrial revolutions that we have talked about that give you strength. So even though in many ways it's a large country, it has a large population, its foundations, particularly its economic foundation, is incredibly weak. And just to give you a sense of that, during the war, there were times when Russian soldiers were told to assault positions even though they didn't have guns, right? So they were soldiers and they were told, go ahead and attack. And this was ordering troops, some of whom did not have guns, to launch an attack. And they were just told, when one of your friends gets killed, just take their gun and continue the attack. That does not inspire confidence, right? And that shows a weakness in your economy when you're throwing men into battle without actually giving them weapons. And at times, Russian soldiers were reduced to throwing rocks at their enemies. It doesn't happen that often, but just the fact that it happens reveals how weak their economy was and the problems in their government. So Russia will be the first, in a sense, to become exhausted and drop out. It will endure at least 2 revolutions and will sign a separate peace, giving up and ending the war. And we'll talk more about those revolutions in section 9. But currently now Germany only has one front. Remember, that was Germany's weakness, was it only has, it has to fight on the east and on the west. But now Germany is able to, because Russia has given up, is able to take a whole bunch of troops and move them west and throw them all at France. So it looks like Germany's actually going to win this thing in 1917. What stops Germany from just winning at this time is that the United States will finally enter the war and will enter it on the side of the Allies, on the side of Britain and France. We do this for multiple reasons. One is that there has been a long kind of simmering tension with Germany. Remember, the United States almost went to war with Germany in 1916 because of the sinking of the Lusitania. The Germans did a lot of things that are kind of counterproductive to war, or to what I mean to their overall war goals. So, for example, German agents in the United States actually bombed factories. They bombed American factories. So you'd have an American factory that had an order from the British government to make them ammunition, and German agents would actually set off a bomb to try and disrupt the supply. And when you think about this, I mean, it's really loony. It's just not a good idea. Even if this is successful, it's not really going to have that great of an effect, but it really made the Americans angry because we figured out who did it. I mean, it's like, gee, someone starts bombing factories that are building things for the Allies. Gee, I wonder if it could be one of the enemies of the Allies who's doing it. So this is really just a bad idea. Not only is it wrong, but it just makes the Americans angry. So there's prior problems with Germany that makes the Americans already kind of lean towards the British and to the French, right? In part because Germany is doing crazy things like that, and killing American civilians. Another example is the Zimmermann telegram. It's called the Zimmermann telegram because a German diplomat named Zimmermann sent it to the Mexican government. And we'll talk more about Mexico in section 9, and that will give us a better idea of why this was just a dumb thing to do. I remember earlier I said that this war isn't being fought primarily because people are dumb. That doesn't mean that people don't occasionally do dumb things, and this is an example. In the Zimmermann telegram, the this representative of the German government was offering Mexico basically assistance and help if Mexico would invade the United States. Right, so a German diplomat was trying to get Mexico to invade the United States before we were even at war with Germany. Now, this was crazy. Mexico was undergoing a revolution and would not have been able to launch an effective invasion of the United States. It would have been suicidal for the Mexicans to do this. And so they politely said no to this. But again, this is just this really weird thing to do. And the British will intercept this telegram and hold on to it. And when we're already really angry at the Germans, we'll show it to us, and this will make the Americans even angrier, right? Because we're not at war with Germany, but Germany is doing things like, having its agents blow up or bomb American factories and try and get another country to invade us. In addition, practically speaking, Americans had loaned the British and the French a huge amount of money. And if the British and the French lost the war, we wouldn't get that money back, right? You can't get blood from a stone. If you lose the war, you're going to be out of money anyway. You're not going to be able to pay it back. This is a bad situation. So American financial interests support the idea of intervening on the side of the British and the French. And finally, and one thing we have to note is that there was a cultural affinity between the United States and Britain and France that did not exist as strongly as it did with Germany. I mean, there were German Americans, there were people like myself who were descendant from people who were Germanic, and those people tended to favor Germany, but most Americans were more likely to favor Britain because, of course, our history is closely connected to Britain. British people speak English and share a common culture in that sense. In regards to France, there was still a memory that it was the French who had helped us win our revolution. When an American general did Blackjack Pershing, when he arrived in France, he is reported to have said, "Lafayette, we are here." Lafayette was a French noble who, the Marquis de Lafayette, who played an important role as a general for George Washington as an advisor. And there was during the American Revolution. So there was this sense that we owed France, that France had helped us during our time of need, and so we should too. So there was this kind of affinity that Americans felt towards Britain and France. Finally, there was also this idea that together with Britain and France, this was a war that was being fought for democracy and for the preservation of civilization. Germany, even though in some ways it was a liberal capitalist democracy, was not nearly as liberal as Britain and France. It was not nearly as democratic as Britain and France. So Americans tended to feel that Germany was on the side of barbarism, whereas Britain and France were on the side of civilization, so we should fight to help them to defend democracy and civilization. And it's important that Woodrow Wilson understood this war, and Woodrow Wilson was the American president, who we'll talk more about later, as being fought to make the world safe for democracy. Right? This war is being fought to make the world safe for democracy. And essentially, once the Americans are in the war is basically over. I mean, the Germans make one final push in hopes of defeating the British and the French before we're able to bring our power to bear. But the United States is the largest industrial power in the world. The other countries have been at war for 4 years. We're fresh. And since this war is basically a war of attrition, once we're in the war, it's effectively over. I'm not trying to take away, Americans did fight bravely, but it's not like there was some American victory that ultimately ended the war. That's not really how it worked. What it was essentially was the fact that we could field all these fresh soldiers. We had all this industrial power. And so in 1918, Germany will finally surrender. We'll say we can't possibly win this war. One thing, though, I want to emphasize, when the German army surrenders, they're still in France. Right, the German army still surrenders while they are still in France. And that's going to be a big deal later on because many Germans don't understand why they lost World War I during this time period. They're like, we had soldiers in France. How do you lose a war when you have troops in enemy territory? Right, the enemy had not entered Germany. So how is it that we lost a war when we have troops in the enemy's country, but we have no enemy troops in our country? That will become important later on. But 9 million military and 6 million civilian dead approximately, give or take a million. I don't know. Once you get to this many people, I don't think it matters that much in a sense what the exact number is. These are huge numbers of people who die. And I think, again, if the Europeans would have understood ahead of time that this is what it would have led to, they would have worked out a compromise. They didn't, though. No, because we don't know what the future holds. And so a lot of people died. So the actual negotiations to end the war result in what's called the Treaty of Versailles. Right, which was signed in 1919. And this treaty has some problems, has some flaws that will help lead to the German rise of the Nazis and, in a sense, to World War II. So it's very important to understand this treaty. So first of all, what we have to remember is that many people have died in this war. Like I just said, about 15 million. So they needed to figure out something in hindsight that would have made this war be worth it. Why was it that my father died? Why did my husband die? Why did my brother die? Why did my friends die? What good is going to come out of this? And what made things really complex was that different countries understood the war as being fought for different reasons. For example, the Americans will argue, as we'll see shortly, this war was fought for very idealistic reasons to make the war safe for democracy. France understood this war as being fought in order to protect its national security. The British understood this as being meant to maintain the balance of power in Europe and to preserve their empire. Germany had its own reasons for fighting the war, but it loses, so those, in a sense, are not going to be significant as during the actual negotiations. So one thing that makes this really complicated is that they need to find a reason to make all these deaths worth it, but people understood themselves as having fought the war for very different reasons. So this makes this extraordinarily complex. However, one thing that people, except in a sense for the Americans, one thing that especially the British and French agreed upon was that the Germany was at fault and Germany had to pay. So this is what we would call a kind of victor's justice, right? Victor's justice. One thing I tried to explain when this war, in terms of how the war began, I focused on these different causes, which were kind of equal, right? Everyone had, in a sense, this memory of wars not lasting that long and not killing many people. Everyone was a part of this alliance system. But that's how I understand things now as a historian. British and French people who, and their view is in a sense the most important because they're on the winning side, living in this time who actually have to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, they look back and they say, this was Germany's fault. Germany's the one that attacked. It's Germany's fault. So Germany is forced to accept what's called the War Guilt Clause, which says this war was our fault. And that gives legal grounds to force Germany to pay reparations. Basically, Germany has to pay a bunch of money to France and Britain to pay for the damages caused by the war, which is, according to the treaty, Germany's fault. Germany will also lose land. Remember Alsace and Lorraine, that territory my ancestors are from, that had been under French control. Germany took it from France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Now it goes back to France. It still belongs to France. In addition, there will also be a demilitarized zone in Germany along this border with France. A demilitarized zone is a place where you cannot put your army. So the Germans are not allowed to put troops in a particular area of land, even though it's in their country. And you can imagine that would be kind of frustrating. Imagine if Canada said, hey, America, you can't put troops up here, or even though it's your own country. Or imagine if Mexico told us, oh, you can't put troops in California because it borders with us and we don't like that. So that's very humiliating to Germany. And Germany's army is placed under serious limits. Germans are not supposed to have airplanes, for example, anymore. They're not allowed to have an air force. They're only allowed to have an army of, I believe, 100,000 soldiers, which is nothing. Remember, we talked about that the British on the first day of the Battle of the Somme had 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing. So an army of 100,000 is like nothing. So, and Germany has no choice but to accept this treaty. Remember, like I said earlier, Germany is under blockade, and civilians in Germany and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire are not able to get enough food to eat, and so some of them are literally starving to death. So Germany really has no choice but to accept this treaty. And as I said before, this is very confusing and frustrating because, like they said, they weren't actually defeated decisively in battle. Like I said, the Germans had troops in France, and there weren't really any enemy troops on German territory, but they knew that they would lose anyway, so they just gave in at this point. This basically discredits the German government, so there's actually going to be a communist revolt in Germany. It will be put down, but that's something else we have to remember, is there is a communist movement in Germany, people who would like communism to be the system that Germany follows. That will be, like I said, that revolt will be suppressed, though, and Germany will become a democracy, what we sometimes call the Weimar democracy, but this democracy will be weak and divided. It's not going to be a very powerful democracy at all, and Germany will become a much weaker country because of the Treaty of Versailles. And it's really important. I know this can be kind of difficult to follow. It's hard to remember all this stuff, but this is key to understanding why we'll eventually have the rise of the Nazis in Germany later on. Now, the Europeans were mostly focused, especially the British and the French, on having a weak Germany. That was their goal. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, will still make his own contribution, and he argues essentially that to make World War I meaningful, it should be a war to end all wars. He also argued it should make the world safe for democracy. But our key point here is that he wanted this to be a war to end all wars. That's the only thing that could make this war, in his mind, worth it, if this is the last war. So he will And the thing is, because the United States is so powerful, because we've loaned a lot of money to the British and the French, and because it's our intervention that puts the balance of power in the war towards the British and the French and Allied victory, what we say is important. So one thing that Woodrow Wilson will push through is the idea of a League of Nations, that basically this is a forerunner of the United Nations, but the hope is that you can get countries to work out their problems democratically. It's in a sense an institution of the concert of Europe. Basically, the idea of the League of Nations is you bring all these different countries together, so if they have a problem, they can work out a compromise rather than fighting a war. Right now we know what wars will do. Now we know that a war, a breakdown in peace, will kill huge numbers of people. So we need an institutional way to deal with that. The League of Nations will have some problems. People often laugh and make fun of the League of Nations, but I think the intent was good. One thing it didn't work out as well was, even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, he doesn't do a very good job of selling it to the American people, and the Americans will not actually ever join the League of Nations. But in any case, the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's idea to work out problems between countries democratically through compromise instead of war. It will exist, and it's the forerunner of the United Nations. His other idea was what's called national self-determination. Woodrow Wilson basically argued that this war began, in a sense, because of frustrated nationalism, right? The Serbs wanted to have a country that included all Serbs, and that led them to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And so his idea was, we need to satisfy nationalism. This war was fundamentally caused by nationalism, so if we can make sure that everyone is happy with their nation state, with their borders, then we will have peace. And based on this idea, the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires will be split up and be reorganized into nation states. They'll be replaced by independent countries. Now, the thing is, there is a limit to this. This national self-determination, this idea that each nation that wants to have its own state, is not applied to the colonies and empires of the victors. So the British Empire doesn't get smaller from this war, it gets bigger. The French Empire does not get smaller from this war, it gets bigger. The American Empire also stays the same. This war does not lead to the Philippines becoming independent. This war will therefore redraw the map of Europe, right? We've seen this map before, but I just want to highlight this. Imagine if I was to give you a quiz on this map. It would be a relatively easy quiz because look at how many countries there are, right? We have Great Britain is 1, France is 2, Spain is 3, Germany is 4, Switzerland is 5, Austria-Hungary is 6, Italy is 7, Russia is 8, Romania is 9, Bulgaria is 10, and so on and so forth. There's about 14 or 15 different countries here. Fairly easy map quiz. But wow, look at the map now after World War I. Now we have a bunch of new countries that weren't even on the map before. Austria-Hungary have become 2 separate countries. Czechoslovakia now exists. Poland, right, which had been a country for a long time but had ceased to exist as a country, is back. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia there. You have all these new countries. So the maps suddenly become a lot more complex. Instead of the Ottoman Empire, we've got this place called Transjordan. We've got Syria. We've got Iraq. So things have really changed, right? In a sense, the borders have become much more complex. The old empires, the German Empire in a sense, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they are now gone, right? In this effort to try and redraw the lines of Europe, the borders of Europe, to satisfy everyone's desire for their own nation state, right? That's in theory what was supposed to happen. That's what this was supposed to do. It doesn't work perfectly because, of course, we're going to have World War II, but it does certainly have a significance, right? Because now we have a bunch of new countries. This would make for a much harder map quiz.